Hello everyone, my name is Garvin and I read things and glibber about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today, we are starting a series of videos that might take a while if I'm going to be honest with you. Now, as some of you already know, I do look at various creatures and beings in mythology, and we're going to be diving into the lore of mermaids. This was chosen by my ever-wise patrons. By the way, you can join their ranks by clicking on the link below. A little as $1 a month gets you a vote on upcoming content. If you'd rather leave a one-time donation, there's also a coffee link. Thank you. The reason the patrons chose this was, well, last year in 2023, I did an extended series on Atlantis, and some of them were confused as to why mermaids don't show up in most Atlantis stories, with the exception of the DC comic universe, and the only reason they're there is Superman's fault. I'm not going to retread that ground. You can check out my video on Aquaman's Atlantis Chronicles for more details on that. But since mermaids and Atlantis apparently don't mix, some of my ever-wise patrons wanted to know what was going on with mermaids in mythology and folklore. So I start doing my research, digging into various books, bestiaries, and other sources, and oh man, did I underestimate just how much is out there. I really did. I mean, look, every continent has myths and folk tales involving mermaids. Even Australia has indigenous mermaid myths. China, the Philippines, Japan, North America, South America, Africa, and India, and of course Europe, all have mermaids. There's a wide variation here, too. Australian myth, for example, has mermaids living in freshwater rivers and watering holes as opposed to the ocean, and that's a small variation on the myth. So I ended up having to ask a question of just what makes a mermaid a mermaid? What is going to be my definition here? Because one thing I learned in college is before you tackle a large and diverse subject, as mermaids apparently are, you have to define your terms. Otherwise, no one knows what you're talking about, and before you know it, you are lost and adrift in a stormy sea of confusion. So, let me take you on a quick trip on what is and what is not a mermaid, at least for the purpose of this video series. Feel free to disagree, of course, but I am going to ask you to leave behind a comment explaining your own definition on what makes a mermaid. Let's start with the most obvious. They have to be aquatic, by which I mean mainly living in water and being able to live there for extended periods without aid or magic items. Now, I'm not opposed to mermaids or mermen being amphibious, where they can live on land and water and go back and forth, but they do need to primarily live in the water. Now, an unexpected wrinkle showed up, and that wrinkle was, how do I define living in water? Just to give a couple of examples, there's the underwater cannibal people covered in my Creatures of North America and Atlantis video. They're from Cherokee Stories. They use rivers as a gateway to travel to and from their realm to ours. Their realm is basically a kind of fairyland, and it's not aquatic. Then there's the Kushtaka, who are a shape-shifting race of otter people from the Pacific Northwest. They, by the way, will kidnap unattended swimming children and torture them into otter shapes, which is terrifying and shows how the folklore of North America is pretty metal, but they also live in a sort of mystic other place that is accessible only by the sea, as opposed to actually living in the sea. So, I'm not counting them as mermaids. On top of that, there's also the Irish Merrow, who need a magical cap to be able to live under the water, and otherwise are just humans with green hair and the odd batch of scales. I think being able to live unassisted in deep water is kind of the most basic requirement of mermaidhood. So I am putting that as rule number 1. Second, they should normally exist in a hybrid form, where their body is part human and part something else that is related to water, if not the sea. Now, I'm willing to be rather fluid on this and say it doesn't have to be a fish. I'm also willing to go with marine mammal, eel, or even snakes, as that tends to be common in African mermaid myths. This, to give you an example, leads us to the boto, a Brazilian shapeshifter that spends most of its life out in the river, has a river dolphin, but during the night it can transform into a handsome young man in a white suit who seeks out feminine companionship. But they hide a clue to their true origin in that they still have a dolphin blowhole at the top of their head that they hide under a hat. They're also twin-tailed mermaids. Mermaids who have two tails instead of one. They're sometimes called Melusines, after the most famous lady of the group, but her story, I think, is going to wait for its own video. I'm also okay with mermaids being shapeshifter, as long as their, quote, natural, unquote, form is that of a hybrid being. So Selkies, which are a type of fae that uses a magic coat to change from seal to human, aren't going to count here, and neither are the lake and river fae of Western Europe, who are typically women who come from magical kingdoms on the other side of the water, and they will marry a young lad and bring him wealth and happiness. But, if the boy breaks a rule that they set before the marriage, those ladies take off to their homeland, never to return. I'll note that those ladies would also fail the aquatic rule as well, because these magic kingdoms are fairly dry, given that these ladies often show up to the wedding bringing their husband herds of cattle and goats and sheep, which are hard to find at the bottom of large bodies of water. There are also other legions of water fae, nymphs, various lake and river spirits that are not going to count here, as most of them just take the form of men or women and don't have any hybrid animal forms at all. The last requirement is going to be that they have to be at least semi-physical and alive. There are stories of spirits and ghosts that take on mermaid-like qualities, but I'm going to go ahead and say they don't count. To give an example, the Russian spirit, the Rusalka, is often depicted as having mermaid-like traits in art, but is also said to be the ghost of a young woman who committed suicide or who was murdered by drowning. So in revenge, they seek to lure young men out to the water and drown them in turn. Terrifying and brutally tragic, because maybe there wouldn't be this problem of angry ghosts of murdered women seeking unrelenting vengeance if we explored non-murdery ways of solving our problems with each other. Just a thought. Maybe let it swim around in the back of your head a bit. But getting back to topic. While the Rusalka is tragic and scary, has his other stories along that lines, I'm going to say an angry ghost isn't a mermaid, especially if she was a human being in life. Now, within these requirements, I am going to be fairly lenient, because there's a lot of variation to deal with here. For example, there are mermaid myths where mermaids have the legs, arms, and head of a human being, but the body and tail of a fish. Or just the head of a fish on a human body, which sounds like a real awkward way to go through life, honestly. I'm also not going to exclude mermaids who are divine or semi-divine in nature, or those who have supernatural powers. I'm also going to be inclusive of mermen, who exist in a number of myths, but aren't as popular as their lady friends. We'll be looking at benign and malevolent mermaids, mermaids who want to marry humans, mermaids who hate humans and want to drown us or even eat us, and mermaids who are rather indifferent to us altogether. This is going to leave us a vast amount of myth and folklore to wade through, so I am going to take a couple more weeks here. I apologize for the wait, but among other things, I've had some personal issues pop up that have eaten on a good amount of my time and energy, so I am behind on my research, and I apologize for that. That said, I'd rather have a couple weeks where I don't release anything than release something I hate or regard as bad quality, and I hope you can support that. All that said, we should be able to get out at least one more video in March, and I will keep going on the mermaids here until this is finished, so brace yourselves, we might be heading into some deep, rough waters. I think I'll wrap up here for this video. I hope you found it informative or at least entertaining. If so, please leave a like or a comment or consider subscribing. All those help me in my eternal struggle against the dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. Thank you for watching, and special thanks to Big Steve, my biggest supporter. When I return, we're going to tackle the oldest stories of the mermaids I can find and go from there. I hope you'll join me, and until then, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading.